My sister had always been independent, even though she was wheelchair-bound. But for Karen, the dictator of the HOA, that didn't matter. For her, everything revolved around the association's idiotic rules. And when my sister refused to pay absurd fines for violating aesthetic standards, Karen decided to take extreme action. She tried to use a stun gun on her. If someone told me that one day I would witness a scene worthy of a police movie, with screams, sirens, and a woman being dragged out of her house by the police, I would probably laugh. But after what happened to my sister, it doesn't seem so absurd. I always knew that the HOA in this neighborhood was problematic. Those associations that meddle in other people's lives for the sheer fun of it, sending out fines for any ridiculous reason. Grass too high, Christmas decorations out of date, curtains in an unapproved color. But no one expected things to escalate so far. My sister Laura moved here a year ago. A wheelchair user since she was 19, she has always been a strong, independent, and, above all, stubborn woman. If there's one thing she can't stand, it's people trying to control her. Her house was perfect for her. Single story, with a large, accessible yard. Everything seemed great, until the HOA decided to show up. At first, it was a minor nuisance. Little notes on the door complaining about ridiculous things, like the height of the mailbox. Then came the more serious notices, a fine for having an inappropriate carpet on the balcony, another for a misalignment in the position of the garbage can. But when they started picking on the access ramp she had installed in front of her house, her patience ran out. The HOA claimed that the ramp was not in keeping with the aesthetics of the neighborhood, and that it needed to be removed or replaced with something more harmonious with the environment. Laura, being the lawyer that she is, completely ignored it. Because guess what? Accessibility isn't optional. It's the law. She even tried to be polite at first. She sent emails explaining the situation, quoting regulations, and pointing out that they were violating basic rights. But the response she received was a mixture of arrogance and veiled threats. The kind of thing that only someone who has never faced consequences in their life has the courage to write. And the leader behind this persecution, a woman who ran the HOA like her own personal empire. One of those people who think they own the neighborhood, walking around with a notebook and a look of superiority. For her, rules weren't guidelines. They were weapons. And my sister, in her eyes, was an affront to the perfect order of the community. It was then that the warnings started arriving more frequently, each one more absurd than the last. First, they threatened to foreclose on her house if the fines weren't paid. Then they even hinted that they might sue her for disobeying HOA guidelines. Laura, of course, laughed it off. She knew it was pure nonsense. But what no one expected was that this woman would go so far as to completely cross the line between neighborhood authority and real crime. The day it all blew up was one of those days when the weather seemed to predict the storm. My sister was coming home after a tiring day at the courthouse when she realized something was wrong. The garage light wouldn't come on. The doorbell wasn't working. The Wi-Fi, which she always used to open the automatic door, was down. And then, when she went to the door, it happened. This woman, the leader of the HOA, suddenly appeared, holding a taser. Yes, a bloody taser. Her logic? My sister was invading her own home because, according to the HOA, her property was in debt to the community and officially considered in serious violation of the rules. So she thought it was a good idea to use physical force to prevent my sister from entering. The electric shock hit Laura in the shoulder, but she didn't fall. That's not how it works. The taser didn't knock her down. It just caused absurd pain. And that's when the chaos began. The neighbors heard the screams. Some people ran to see what was happening. One of them recorded everything. And before this woman could try to escape, someone had already called the police. I arrived shortly afterwards, called by one of the neighbors. When I saw my sister trembling, Still trying to process what had happened, something inside me boiled over. It wasn't just anger. It was pure hatred. This woman had just committed a crime, a serious crime. And the irony? She had done this to a lawyer specializing in civil rights and consumer protection. If she thought she could get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. And I made sure she knew it. The scene that unfolded after the police arrived was one of the most satisfying things I've ever witnessed. Seeing that woman, who had spent months giving my sister hell, being handcuffed in her own backyard, was almost poetic. But before we got to that glorious moment, there was a brief, pathetic show of denial and cheap theater. As soon as the cars pulled up in front of Laura's house, the policemen got out with that, "What the fuck is going on now?" look on their faces. Because, let's face it, nobody expects to respond to a call of assault with a stun gun in the middle of a middle-class condominium. My sister, still visibly shaken, was trying to explain what had happened. The neighbors who witnessed the scene were outraged. Some were shouting, others were recording, and there was even a retired man who looked ready to hit HOA Karen with his cane. And then, as if she had just remembered that she needed to defend herself, that woman sprang into action. "This is a misunderstanding," she shouted, raising her hands as if she were the victim. "This woman had no authorization to be here." The police were silent for a moment, probably trying to understand how someone could say such an idiotic thing with such conviction. One of the officers, a tall guy with a friendless face, crossed his arms and looked at her with pure incredulity. "So you're telling me that this house doesn't belong to her?" HOA. Karen hesitated. This was the first sign that she knew she had made a gigantic mistake, but she still decided to double down on the idiocy. Her property was under violation. The HOA has the authority to prevent defaulters from accessing the home. That's when Laura, still shaking from the shock, let out a dry laugh. The kind of laugh you let out when someone says something so ridiculous that your brain refuses to process it. And then, finally, my sister showed who she really was. "What part of the United States Constitution gives you this right?" she asked, still holding her sore shoulder. "Or did you just make that rule up in your head?" The woman opened her mouth, but nothing came out. It was at that moment that she realized she wasn't dealing with an ordinary resident. This wasn't someone who would just accept the HOA's abuse of power. She had tried to attack a lawyer with a taser, and now she was about to pay dearly for it. The officers started asking questions, and her answers became more and more desperate. First, she tried to deny that she had used the taser. "I was just trying to stop her from coming in until we resolved the situation civilly." That's when one of the neighbors showed her the video he had recorded. It was clear from the look on the policeman's face that this woman's theater was over. "So you think it's legal to hit someone with an electric shock for an HOA fine?" she stammered. She tried to say that she was just following the rules of the association. But the officer was already tired of the conversation. He turned to my sister. "Do you want to press charges?" Laura looked at the woman, then at the policeman, and then smiled. "Absolutely." And that's how the great president of the HOA left the condominium escorted out, handcuffed, shouting that this was an abuse of authority and that she would sue everyone. But it didn't end there. The criminal case was only the first part. My sister wanted more, and I was more than happy to help. Over the next few weeks, while this woman dealt with the consequences of her stupidity, Laura began to put together a case against the entire HOA. Because if this crazy woman went so far as to physically attack someone, it meant that the association was out of control, and my sister wanted to nip this rotten organization in the bud. The plan was simple. Use every absurd rule, every illegal fine, every fraudulent document we could find to dismantle the HOA from the inside out. And lucky for us, the list of irregularities was long. Years of abuse of power, years of ridiculous fines, threats against residents, mysterious fees that disappeared without explanation. What began as a criminal case was turning into something much bigger. And when the HOA realized that it was in the sights of a lawyer who had nothing to lose, panic began to spread. The meetings became chaotic. The council members were nervous, some trying to distance themselves from the scandal, others trying to convince the residents that they had nothing to do with the president's decision. But it was too late. That woman had made the biggest mistake of her life. And now, she and the entire HOA were about to pay for it. The fall of the HOA was as glorious as I had hoped. In the days following the former president's arrest, the neighborhood turned into pandemonium. Residents, previously intimidated, began to rebel. And, like any authoritarian empire, all it took was a little push for everything to fall apart for good. My sister, now recovered from the electric shock and absolutely focused on destroying that rotten system, spent days studying every document, every rule, every financial transaction of that association. And that's when we found the first cracks. The HOA's money has always been a mystery. Residents paid absurd fees every month, supposedly for community maintenance. But when they started asking where exactly this money was being spent, the answers became increasingly vague. Oh, it was for repairs to the children's playground, improvements to neighborhood security, administrative services. But, curiously, no one could point to a single repair that had been done recently. The playground still had the same rusty toys from years ago. Neighborhood security consisted of a sleepy watchman who spent more time on his cell phone than patrolling, and the administrative services were as mysterious as a secret society. My sister knew there was dirt there, and where there's dirt, there's a trail of documents waiting to be discovered. That's when she started infiltrating HOA meetings. Yes, because even with the president in jail, the association still tried to continue operating as if nothing had happened, as if the attempt to electrocute a wheelchair user was just a minor administrative inconvenience. But what they didn't realize was that they were dealing with a lawyer who smelled fraud from miles away. Laura sat quietly in meetings, listening attentively, asking innocent questions, and little by little, the pieces began to fall into place. First, we discovered that HOA fees had increased dramatically over the last 3 years, coincidentally since the former president took office. Then we found evidence of overpriced contracts with maintenance companies that simply didn't exist. That's right. The money that residents paid to take care of the neighborhood was going straight into bank accounts that no one could trace. And finally, the final blow. Financial records indicated that the former president was using HOA money to pay for personal expenses, luxury trips, expensive dinners, shopping in designer stores, all financed with the residents' money. It was corruption. It was theft. And above all, it was the kind of crime that could land you in jail. My sister collected everything, every statement, every suspicious transaction, every fake contract. When the dossier was ready, the file was over 100 pages of pure destruction. And then, the big day arrived. Laura waited patiently until the monthly HOA meeting, which was now in absolute chaos. The remaining members were desperately trying to save the association, insisting that it was all just a misunderstanding. But as soon as my sister entered the room and placed the dossier on the table, silence overtook the room. "Good evening," she said with a cold smile. "I think you'll want to take a look at this." The advisors flipped through the pages in silence, their faces growing paler and paler. Some tried to argue, but Laura simply pointed to the numbers, to the evidence, to the false signatures. They were trapped. The residents, who had previously watched everything without knowing what to do, began to revolt. Cries of indignation echoed through the hall. "So that's why we're paying these absurd fees? They've been stealing our money all this time. I want my money back." And then, the best part, my sister formally announced that she was filing a class action lawsuit against the HOA, representing the residents who had been wronged for years. The look on the board members' faces was priceless. Some tried to sneak out, but were surrounded by angry neighbors. Others tried to defend themselves, saying they didn't know anything, but no one was willing to listen to excuses. At that moment, it was clear. The HOA was finished. The residents themselves, now armed with evidence and accumulated anger, began to demand the dissolution of the association. In a matter of days, emergency meetings were held, votes were counted, and in the end, the verdict was unanimous. The HOA would be closed for good. Mandatory fees? Eliminated. The ridiculous rules? Thrown in the trash. The former president's empire? Reduced to ashes. But the final blow was still missing. My sister wanted justice, and that meant making sure the former president paid for everything she had done. And she would, with interest. The last piece of the puzzle was already in place. A full fiscal audit, conducted by none other than the government itself. And if this woman thought dealing with Laura was difficult, waiting until she had to face the IRS was going to be her real nightmare. The end was near, and I couldn't wait to watch it. If there's one thing I've learned during this whole mess, it's that seeing someone who thinks they're untouchable finally getting what they deserve is one of life's greatest satisfactions. The HOA had already been completely destroyed. The residents were finally free from the absurd fees and the tyrannical control of that woman. But the perfect outcome was still missing. Seeing the ex-president of the association pay, for real, for everything she did. And justice came like an avalanche. First came the financial part. With the dissolution of the HOA, all its finances were investigated even more thoroughly. Laura had already uncovered signs of fraud and over-invoicing. But when the authorities started digging into the former administration's bank accounts, what they found was practically a how to steal from an entire community and get away with it manual. To begin with, the former president wasn't just embezzling money from the HOA, she was creating bogus fees, illegally increasing fines, and signing overpriced contracts with companies that, get this, belonged to her family and friends. The money that was supposed to go towards maintaining the community, it paid for lavish dinners, international trips, designer clothes, and even her nephew's college tuition. And what happened when the residents found out? Well, imagine a bunch of people who were already furious about paying absurd fees finding out that this money had been used to buy expensive handbags and go sightseeing in Europe. The whole neighborhood became a war zone. Neighbors demanded every penny back. Some began to consider individual legal actions against her, in addition to the collective lawsuit that Laura was already leading. It was like watching a house of cards collapse all at once. But that was only the beginning. The IRS also got into the game. When you embezzle money, one day or another, someone notices. And when it comes to the government, you can be sure that they won't ignore a single penny. The inspectors analyzed the last 5 years of the HOA's finances and, to absolutely no one's surprise, discovered that this woman had also been evading taxes. This meant that now she didn't just have a problem with the residents, she had a problem with the government. And when the government wants your money, you can be sure it will take it. So, while my sister's lawyers were preparing to crush her legally, the state itself was already building a solid case against her. But the icing on the cake was the criminal trial. Seeing this woman in the dock, trying to defend herself against the charge of assault with a stun gun, was a spectacle in itself. She entered the courtroom with the same arrogance as always, as if she thought she was going to get off with just a warning and a slap on the wrist. Only she hadn't counted on the video. Yes, that video. The recording made by the neighbor at the exact moment she tried to electrocute my sister in front of her own house. When the prosecutor showed the recording at the hearing, the whole courtroom fell silent. The video showed everything. My sister trying to get into the house. HOA Karen coming out of nowhere, holding the taser like a B-movie cop. The crack of the electric charge hitting Laura's shoulder. The scream of pain. The neighbors running to help. And the best part? Her face as she realized she had made a gigantic mistake. The jurors watched without blinking. The judge? Well, she didn't need long to make up her mind. When the sentence was announced, the former HOA president received a solid conviction for assault with a stun gun and trespassing. No token fine or community service. She was going to get a real sentence. Not an absurd sentence of decades in prison, but enough to ensure that she felt what it was like to lose her freedom. And then, in that crowded courtroom, the best scene of all took place. The officer approached her, asked her to stand up, and turned her back to put the handcuffs on. I swear I've never seen such a profound silence in such a crowded place. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, savoring that moment. Laura, sitting next to me, didn't say anything. She just smiled. A small, discreet smile, but one full of satisfaction. The woman who tried to use the power of the HOA to control everything and everyone, who thought she was above the law, was now just another criminal being led out of a courtroom, surrounded by looks of contempt. But the story didn't end there. While she was busy trying to avoid a longer sentence, the old HOA was facing its own problems. With the end of the association, the residents demanded full transparency. Every penny that had been paid in recent years had to be explained, and any irregularities audited. And what happened to all the ridiculous fines that had been issued over the years? Refunds. That's right. Residents were able to reverse many of the abusive fees that were charged, and those who paid undue fines began to receive their checks back. The irony? My sister received a refund check larger than all the fines the HOA tried to collect from her combined. With that money, she remodeled her house. She installed a new security system. Because, let's face it, after almost being attacked with a taser, she wasn't going to take any more chances. And, to top it all off, she took the rest of the money and used it to finance a big barbecue in the neighborhood, open to all residents, except, of course, anyone who had been an accomplice of the former president. And now the neighborhood is experiencing a new moment. No absurd rules, no ridiculous fees, no people snooping into other people's lives. The former HOA president? Well, after serving her sentence, she disappeared off the map. The last we heard of her, she was trying to sell her house as quickly as possible. But, ironically, without HOA status to inflate prices, her house has fallen in value. Her castle completely collapsed. And my sister? Well, Laura went on with her life, practicing law, winning cases, and enjoying the peace of living in a house that was now truly hers, with no one to tell her what color she could use on the door or where she should put the trash can. And me? I just sat there, watching it all, and enjoying every second of it. If there's one lesson this story leaves us with, it's that people who abuse power always think they'll never be brought down, until they meet someone like Laura. And when that happens, well, I'll just pull up a chair and enjoy the show. And if you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.